Research and Content at Israel's Defense and Security Forum. He's usually based in Tel Aviv, but he's joining us today from Budapest. Thank you very much for your time. Now, as Daniel mentioned there, Israel has declared a new war goal, a formal goal this week, which is to return the tens of thousands of displaced Israelis to that border. Do you believe this ratcheting up of tensions, of fighting, is the best strategy for that?
Thank you for having me. I think we indeed entered a new phase of the war, indeed a new phase of warfare. And Israel, by doing that, the very famous pager and walkie-talkie explosions, as well as the targeted killing of Ibrahim Akil and other 5 senior Hezbollah officials, really did do away from the classic kinetic perception of warfare, and indeed made into a new phase where you prefer sophistication, the discombobulation of enemy command and control structure, throwing enemy militants in disarray. And I think in that Israel really expressed this sophistication of warfare. But I think the deeper outlook is, yes, Israel's objective still remains bringing those 60,000 displaced people, not evacuated, I would call them displaced people, back home to the north. And in so doing, Hezbollah, I think, doesn't allow them to do that, especially by throwing anti-tank missiles, shooting anti-tank missiles, as well as continuous shooting and rocket attacks. And so, in my opinion, I think Israel has no choice but to break this stalemate.
Right. But in terms of breaking that stalemate, the West, for example, the US, some of Israel's allies are concerned that by ratcheting up this fighting, as you mentioned, these are embarrassing security failures for Hezbollah. The risk of an all-out war is not a future that the Middle East could potentially handle, that this wouldn't be in Israel's interest either in getting the hostages back home. What's your view on that?
Well, I think we just need to reframe the conversation. We have to remember how we got there in the first place. Israel did not initiate this war. This war was imposed on Israel on October 7th of last year. The following day, on October 8th, Hezbollah has since then shot over 10,000 rockets and drones and anti-tank missiles on Israel. I think the situation is absolutely untenable. Israel did not initiate. In fact, as a national security researcher, I can tell you that Israel's interest has always been to avoid multi-front war. And indeed, the military has been caught initially in this sort of a dilemma, how to conduct these two fronts. But I would reframe it as an Iranian campaign against Israel on 7 fronts. Lebanon and Hezbollah and Gaza's Hamas are obviously the ones with the highest intensity. Let's remember how we got here in the first place. Israel did not just joyfully cross the border and start attacking Hezbollah.
Some context to what you're saying. You're referring to the fact that Iran backs groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, that are on these 2 fronts of the war, as you say. I also want to ask you about comments by the UN Human Rights Commissioner, because you did refer to those pager and walkie-talkie explosions. He has told the UN Security Council that this was a breach of humanitarian law, and I want to get your view. Do you believe attacks that jeopardize civilian lives in this way are justified, given of course the context of the war that you're talking about?
Yeah, I would say that that's within the limits of the laws of armed warfare. I would just say that for terrorist organizations that interweave themselves into such a dense fabric of civilian society, I would say it's almost impossible to pinpoint 100% to Ibrahim Akil or the 5 other people who are senior Hezbollah militants. And the United Nations, in my opinion, is playing a very dangerous game, because it used to have a reputation, and now it has just become crying wolf, calling every single action that Israel does a breach of humanitarian affairs. We saw it in the 48-hour operation in Jenin that led to the death of 12 terrorists and no civilians. They call it a humanitarian catastrophe. We saw how the 35 people who were the militants who were killed in an UNRWA school strike by Israel in Gaza, there were 0 civilians there, simply Hamas militants who took over the compound. So crying wolf and sort of giving alerts against civilian collateral damage, I think it's dangerous for the UN.
Right. Well, what you're referring to is that Hamas fighters, according to Israel, have been sheltering in some of these civilian infrastructures that have been targeted. In terms of what the UN Human Rights Commissioner is arguing, he has said the problem with attacks like walkie-talkies and pagers exploding this way is that it's placing booby traps in objects that would otherwise appear harmless. That's what he said. And that rather than targeted attacks, these are attacks that are putting civilian lives in danger. Do you believe an attack like that is one that any country would be able to avoid civilians getting wrapped up in? Because the injuries are said to be very dangerous, with several people in critical condition after them.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you that this is a consideration that cabinet has to make. To what extent do we want to have civilian casualties? And of course, if we compare it to the ratio, the civilian military ratio of other militaries around the world, the US, UK, the French army around the world, certainly in Afghanistan and Iraq, but not only there, we can see that this has to balance out. This could all have been avoided had Hezbollah not started shooting at Israel on October the 8th. There used to be a status quo of ceasefire right beforehand. And as I said, Israel has no interest in fighting multi-front war. I just think that we have to be more careful in assessing violations of warfare, especially when Israel was not the one initiating this war. And the interest here is to finish off as quickly as possible. In my opinion, there has to be a de-Hezbollahization of Lebanon, and Israel, I think, would do well in using those fault lines within Lebanese society. I'm half Lebanese myself. I would be happy if Druze, Christians, Sunni, other groups within Lebanon would tear apart from Hezbollah and maybe chart a new future for Israelis and Lebanese to decide upon their own future.
All right, Or Yissachar, Vice President for Research and Content at Israel's Defense and Security Forum. Thank you for your time and